الله ورسوله صلى الله تعالى عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. أما بعد. All praise is due to Allah. We seek His guidance, we seek His forgiveness, we seek His assistance, we seek refuge in Allah from the evil within ourselves and from the evil of our actions. Whomsoever Allah guides, there is no one to lead astray, and whomsoever Allah sends astray, there is no one to guide him. I bear witness there is no one worthy of worship except Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is His servant and His messenger. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, upon His servant, His companions, and all those who follow them until the last day. O you who believe, revere Allah as He should be revered, and do not die except in a state of surrender. Beloved brothers and sisters in Islam, today I intend to continue the series I began several khutbahs ago in terms of talking about the challenging issue that must be addressed within our community, and that is the issue related to domestic violence. Previously, we've spoken about the importance of preserving the human's dignity and the nobility that is God-given. And we also spoke about how to establish and maintain healthy relationships based on the Quran and the Sunnah of our beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we also considered or looked at the various forms of domestic violence that exist, as well as the impacts that domestic violence has on members of the household and especially on our children. The focus of today's khutbah is to be able to address and consider a number of myths related to domestic violence, and to be able to understand what are the true facts concerning these matters. Now, although there are many different myths that exist related to this issue, I will only deal with 5 in this khutbah for the sake of brevity. The first myth to consider when it comes to domestic violence, and we hear this statement all the time, where somebody will say, it can't be that bad, he never even laid a hand on her. It can't be that bad, he never laid a hand on her. So this is the first myth that is the most common actually, because there is a misconception, it's not domestic violence until you actually physically hit someone. Before that, it's not domestic violence. And so as long as you don't lay a hand on another member of the household, then it's not considered as domestic violence. This is a myth. The unfortunate reality is that when women approach imams to speak about domestic violence, most of the times imams will only see the physical abuse because that's what is the easiest to detect, rather than the other forms of abuse that take place, unless a woman discloses them. Physical abuse has more clear and obvious signs. They have obvious indicators, bruising or whatnot. But according to an imam in the United States, whose name is Imam Muhammad Majid, he's based in the DC area, and he's been addressing domestic violence issues for the past 2 decades. And he says the following. He says, I have seen a lot of physical abuse, but usually when it reaches the point of physical abuse, make no mistake about it, all other forms of abuse have already taken place. Once it gets to the point of the physical, all the other forms have already taken place before that. So he said that women come to you after they have been completely exhausted. When they have been broken and psychologically devastated, that's when they come to you. That's after they have been physically hit. So that becomes the breaking point. That once they get physically hit, that's the point where they begin to reach out. But there have been so many forms of abuse that precede that hit. And this is something that we need to be able to understand. Based on previous khutbahs that we've spoken about, it's clear there are many other forms of abuse, other than the physical, that exist. And they most often precede the physical. They come before the physical. So there's the predominant forms of abuse, the emotional abuse, the verbal abuse, the intimidation, the psychological abuse. These are the most prevalent forms of abuse that take place. And so they account for the majority of occurrences of domestic violence. Remember, the physical don't account for the majority. They only account for about maybe 10% of physical domestic violence issues, the physical. The other 80, 90% of it is all based on the other forms of domestic violence. The majority being the verbal and the emotional. Those account for around 80% of occurrences of domestic violence, as was mentioned in the previous photo. So, the fact that counters this myth is that a relationship can be abusive without being physically violent. A relationship can be abusive without it being physically violent. And most forms of gender-based violence are not physical. Most forms of gender-based and domestic violence are not physical. And this is based on Statistics Canada in their report, Family Violence in Canada, a Statistical Profile. So in this respect, we're reminded of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's hadith that prohibits all forms of harm. And this is being characteristic of the Muslim. Who is the Muslim? Who is the Muslim and how is the Muslim defined by the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? So we relate the hadith from Imam Ahmad. عن عبد الله ابن عمرو رضي الله عنه قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول المسلم من سلم الناس من لسانه ويده والمهاجر من هجر ما نهى الله عنه. So here's the clear definition from the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Abdullah bin Amr radiallahu anhu narrated that he heard the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam say, the Muslim is the one who avoids harming people, nas, with his tongue and his hands. And the muhajir, or the immigrant, is the one who gives up or abandons all that which Allah has forbidden. That's the true definition of the Muslim and the true definition of the muhajir. One who protects or preserves people from the harm, from their tongue and their hands, and the muhajir is the real muhajir is the one who leaves all that Allah has prohibited. So any of these forms of harm or oppression or violence, they're prohibited within our faith tradition. They're prohibited unequivocally. The second myth is that talking about domestic or gender-based violence in the Muslim community makes Muslims look bad. That when we talk, why don't we talk about this? Is because we're afraid, oh, this is going to make us look really bad in the community at large. It's going to reaffirm a number of the different stereotypes that already exist about Muslims. But rather, no, we need to keep this silent. We need to keep quiet about this so that it doesn't make us look bad. With all of the various challenges that we as Muslims face, being minorities in an increasingly secular society, and also including the higher rates of Islamophobic incidences, or the views and the rhetoric of hatred against Muslims, Muslims are reluctant to speak about issues related to domestic violence or gender-based violence because they feel that it's only going to increase their hardships and their difficulties, and that it's going to reaffirm some of these stereotypes that exist. But the reality that these issues happen within our community, and we're afraid to, or concerned that it's only going to reinforce these misperceptions that other non-Muslims have about us. That's why we don't speak about it. But this is a myth. This is all false. When we speak about these issues, and here's the fact that counters the myth, when we speak about domestic violence or gender-based violence, this shows that Muslims are committed to the safety of all family members, and especially our girls and our women, our sisters, our wives, our daughters. This is part of practicing our faith. And when we speak about it and when we address these issues, it shows that we have this concern about everyone's safety and well-being. And so that's the reason why we need to speak about it. This is not going to reinforce. And if people talk about it in that way, and it becomes a preventative for speaking about these issues, then we need to reevaluate our way of thinking. Because This issue is not going to go away unless we talk about it and unless we deal with it head on. And it's to show that we are committed to the values of mercy, of justice, of wisdom, and of benefit. There are so many hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ that emphasize the importance of taking care of our daughters and our sisters and our wives. Some of which include عن عقبة ابن عامر الجهني رضي الله تعالى عنه قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول من كانت له 3 بنات فصبر عليهن فأطعمهن وسقاهن من جدته كن له حجابا من النار. That the Prophet ﷺ, he said in a hadith narrated by Uqba ibn Amr al-Juhani, whoever has 3 daughters and is patient with them, feeds them, gives them drink, clothes them from his sustenance, they will be a veil of protection for him from the hellfire. These 3 daughters, that when you take care of them well, they will be a hijab, a veil, a protection for you from the nar in the akhirah. In another hadith, and this is a sahih hadith from Imam Ahmad narrates in his Musnad. In another hadith, عن ابن المنكدر رضي الله عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال من كن له 3 بنات أو 3 أخوات فكفلهن وآواهن ورحمهن دخل الجنة. قالوا أو 2 قال أو 2 قالوا حتى ظننا أنهم قالوا أو 1. So this is a hadith narrated from Ibn Munkadir that the Messenger of Allah said, whoever has 3 daughters or 3 sisters and takes care of them, protects them, and is merciful toward them, he will enter into paradise. And they said, even 2? And the Prophet said, even 2. And they said, we thought that somebody even said, even 1? And so this is to show, and there are many different other narrations of these ahadith that talk about the various rewards. Not only are they a hijab from the fire, not only will a person enter into Jannah, but the Prophet ﷺ in another narration, he said, وَجَبَتْ لَهُ الْجَنَّةِ, that paradise becomes obligatory, becomes wajib for such an individual who takes care of his daughters or takes care of his sisters. And in another narration, the Prophet ﷺ said that he will be with me like this in Jannah. So these are the various rewards for being able to take care of our sisters, our daughters, our wives. And so when we address this issue, it shows we care as a community for those who are more vulnerable, and that we're not afraid to face those issues and those challenges that exist within our homes and community head on. It shows that we're not afraid. And at the same time, when Muslim communities speak about domestic violence or gender-based violence, it challenges the Islamophobic beliefs. Doesn't affirm them or reconfirm them. It challenges these Islamic beliefs, phobic beliefs, that Muslims are patriarchal and violent. Because people have that impression. That, Islam, it's a patriarchal religion. Islam is a religion of violence, and especially it oppresses women, and it allows men to violate or to oppress women. When we speak about these issues, it challenges these myths. It challenges these misconceptions that people may have about Muslims and about Islam. Which leads to the third myth. All men are like this. This is an impression that people have. All men are like this. In other words, all men, they have a tendency to behave violently and they do these things. It's all men. This is a myth. The implications behind this myth are many. First, it presupposes that men have an inherent and natural disposition towards violence. And this is clearly false. We know that there are many men who are gentle. There are many men who are non-violent. There are many men who treat their family members well, as is in accordance with the sunnah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who provided us with the best of examples. Look at the greatest example of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When Allah describes him in the Quran, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. That Allah says about the Messenger of Allah, it is out of Allah's mercy that you, O Prophet, have been gentle with them. Had you been cruel or hard-hearted, they would have certainly abandoned you. Second, such a myth, it gives an excuse to men who are perpetrators of violence, that their actions are somehow beyond their control, and that they were created by Allah Almighty disposed to act as such, and hence shouldn't be taken into account or held accountable for their violence. In this myth lies a very grave danger. Not only is it speaking of a great falsehood against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and an enormity against Him, Jalla sha'nahu, but it also attempts to lay blame and responsibility for a man's actions elsewhere, whereas the responsibility lies squarely with the individual making a conscious decision to act violently. Because there is a choice, and a conscious choice that is being made to act in that way. So we can't say, oh, it's something that he just made like that. It's just as part of who he is. We cannot say that. Because every single one of us, we will be held accountable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the choices that we make. And no number of excuses that we offer by those who commit violence against members of their household will ever be able to justify such actions. There's no justification for it. You can't justify any of these actions whatsoever from an Islamic perspective. In fact, our limbs are going to testify against us on the Day of Judgment. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, in many verses, and in one of them, اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون. That Allah says, on this day we shall seal their mouths, and their hands will speak to us, and their feet will testify to what they used to commit. This is the reality that will take place on the Day of Judgment. And so we have to be aware. Third, this myth implies that there are no men who choose to support women and children by standing firmly against issues of domestic violence or all forms of domestic violence and gender-based violence. This is an Islamic duty for every single one of us. Every single man, this is our duty as Muslim men, is our duty. And so such a myth to say, oh, well, all men are like this, it does a disservice to those who challenge this phenomenon and who speak out against these issues. The fact here is that while most perpetrators of domestic violence are men, not all men are perpetrators. That's the reality of it. Most men, in fact, are not perpetrators. Although the vast majority of perpetrators happen to be men, most men are not perpetrators of domestic violence. The fourth myth is that an abused woman should exercise sabr when being abused, as this is a test from Allah. Women who are being abused by their husbands or other family members may feel that they need to endure such behavior, and that not doing so consists of failing a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now this also applies to men, that there are men, although it's a minority of numbers, that are abused by their women. And so this applies to all of them. That a person should not think that, okay, I need to exercise sabr while I'm being abused and do nothing about it. This is not sabr, or the proper use of the definition or the understanding of sabr. At some times, husbands may even state that, or accuse a woman of being weak in her faith, or that she's not a good Muslim wife, or is displeasing to Allah. And he'll use this type of language just to get her to be quiet, just to get her to shut up. No, you have to be patient. I can do whatever I want to, and you have to be patient. This is not what Islam teaches. This constitutes, in fact, a form of abuse in and of itself. It's spiritual abuse. When you misuse Islamic texts or concepts or verses or ahadith in order so that you can perpetrate and to justify your acts of injustice towards her, this is a problem. This is, in fact, a form of abuse where you misuse religious beliefs to justify perpetration of such violence by the spouse against her. What's the fact here? The fact here is that instead of providing healing for women, manipulating the religious interpretation of sabr or patience or perseverance, it minimizes and excuses the violence that they face. And so, although we all face tests from Allah, every single one of us, we have tests from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the nature of the world that we live in. This is part of the dunya. We live in this world as an abode, of bala, of trials and tribulations. But women and others who are being abused are not expected, nor are they advised to accept such oppressive situations as domestic violence or gender-based violence as a form of being patient. Rather, exercising sabr in these contexts means being stronger under such circumstances to actively seek out means and solutions to stop the violence and the abuse while not giving up. That is how we would understand sabr in these circumstances. That it's something that should give them strength so that they can seek out the solutions to stop the violence from happening. And that she continues doing so, or he continues to do so, until the violence stops. That is exercising sabr in these contexts. So the idea is to help one another out, to achieve a state of peace and piety, rather than support one another in sin and in aggression. As Allah says in the Quran, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ شَدِيدُ الْعِقَابِ. That Allah reminds us, cooperate with one another in goodness and in righteousness, and do not cooperate in sin and transgression. And be mindful of Allah. Indeed, Allah is severe in punishment. All of the above myths can be summarized in one final myth, which is what I will conclude with. And that is, Islam condones or encourages domestic violence or gender-based violence. This is a myth. The reality is that domestic violence, gender-based violence, it is a form of dhulm. It is a form of oppression. And Islam unequivocally prohibits committing acts of oppression towards one another. And so this myth also perpetrates the misconception that frames gender-based violence as an issue arising from the deen, that it's an issue related to faith, that it's an issue related to the religion of Islam, which couldn't be further from the truth. Because domestic violence and gender-based violence, they exist in all communities. They exist in all people of all different backgrounds, whether the faith, whether their ethnicity, whether their nationality. The domestic violence is a human problem. It's not something that we just limit it to, one faith tradition has a predominant tendency to commit these. This is wrong. This is false. And so then when we affirm that, or we say that this myth, or that Islam allows or encourages the oppression of women, then you're basically perpetrating that myth, which is to indicate that it's particular to one religious group, or more predominantly found in a religious group or an ethnicity, or. This is false. Domestic violence, it's a human problem. It's a complex social problem that people of all various backgrounds, all different faiths are affected by. But what we need to do is we need to take the steps that require our attention and efforts in order to put a stop to these acts from happening. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله العظيم لي ولكل سائر المسلمين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. I will conclude with 3 take-home messages and action items that will summarize this khutbah. The first is to understand or to know that when we know some of the myths versus some of the facts related to domestic violence, this will help us better understand where our own misconceptions lie. And it will help us to become better informed about the realities of domestic violence within our community and how we can prevent and stop it, both as individuals as well as collectively. That's the first point. The second, we need to become a community of champions against issues of domestic violence and gender-based violence, especially for our brothers. That we need to be champions against domestic violence through our actions and words, to counter some of these myths that exist, to counter these misconceptions like all men are like this. We have to take it upon ourselves to do the right actions so that we counter this myth and we become champions, that we have a great concern for the safety and well-being of all of our family members, or from our wives, our daughters, our sons, our children, all of us. It's our responsibility. And so we need to become champions and to advocate for the protection of those who are vulnerable, and to understand that Islam, without any doubt, it condemns any form of domestic violence rather than perpetrating the myth that Islam condones it. So we have to take that on as a responsibility ourselves. And lastly, we have to continue to learn and put into practice the actions of the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when it comes to how we treat and interact with our families, with our spouses, with our children, with our relatives, with our neighbors, with our friends, with the intention of following his magnificent sunnah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is something that we need to continue to do, and it is a constant effort. It's not something that is a one-off, but rather this is something that we need to continue to grow and improve ourselves in, and to continue to seek out the Messenger of Allah ﷺ sunnah in all of the actions that we do when we interact with those who are around us. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات المسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات إنك يا ربنا سميع قريب مجيب الدعوات ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين اللهم ارحم موتانا وموتى المسلمين واشف مرضانا ومرضى المسلمين وانصر إخواننا المستضعفين المظلومين في كل مكان والطف بنا وبجميع المسلمين بلطفك فيما جرت به المقادير ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار والحمد لله رب العالمين وأقم الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله